Recording in progress.
All right, everybody. Thank you and welcome to the Nib and Ink Fest, the first year we're doing this. And specifically, welcome to the Transformative Fancomics as a Place for Experimentation panel. So to start us off, this panel, just so you know, it is going to be, we're playing basically a pre-recording because we do have some kind of technical elements that we wanted to make sure worked throughout it. This is also going to be streamed to the YouTube, but we'll also be taking questions throughout the panel in the chat because we do have all of the presenters here and present. And so I'll go ahead and introduce us all. So I'm Alexis. I'm a web designer, artist, and writer of the digital. My interests stem from cultural systems and gender as sieved through digital life and how we interact with this new plane of consciousness made tactile through interfaces. I sit in the intersections of research-based theory and openly disseminated low culture, especially in the context of the internet, fan spaces, queer identities, and experimental publishing, best known for Butchverse and Butchverse 2. They/he/she doujinshi. Next is Spicy Yeti, who's an artist, writer, and programmer who has created a variety of experimental and interactive webcomics hosted on spicyyeti.com. Between 2019 and 2025, Spicy Yeti published 5 complete webcomics and has made contributions to other big projects in the webcomic scene like Homestuck. He's the creator of Spicy Webmasters Discord, designed to encourage young artists to learn how to code and add their own creative voices to the internet. And finally, we have Max Banshees, who's a cartoonist and illustrator based in Massachusetts. Their work explores horror, sensuality, and pain through vibrant and surreal depictions of the human body. Illustrations by Max Banshees have appeared in award-winning science fiction and horror publications such as Strange Horizons and Death in the Mouth, as well as in erotic anthologies like Slake House and Denuit. Through Mass Arts Zine Club, their comics have appeared in fairs around New England like MICE and Boston Art Book Fair. All right, so I'm going to get started and play the video, and remember that you can ask questions throughout it, and we'll also have time at the end for additional questions that you'll be able to raise your hand and ask, or again, put in the text.
Hello to everyone at the Nibbin Ink Festival. I'm Spicy Yeti. What you just saw was an animation from my original webcomic Godhead, and I thought that would be an interesting way to start this panel because I got my start in doing webcomics from doing fan comics, particularly Homestuck fan comics, which, because Homestuck is a interactive experimental webcomic itself, sort of taught me the skills that I'd eventually use to make that animation you just saw, which we call a flash. Um, so I thought I would go through just some different examples of storytelling through experiments in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Let's just say that's what my part of the panel is called. So first, let's look at the infinitely scrolling canvas. If you do webcomics, you probably know that these days most webcomics are read on Webtoons and Tapas and stuff. And those actually all have infinite scrolling, not literally infinite, but infinite scrolling canvas, but vertically because you're supposed to read it on your phone. But when I started doing my Homestuck stuff, I began playing with the idea of making the panels sizes depend on the story content. So a lot of the time, the story calls for the user to, scroll horizontally, sometimes vertically and horizontally. And I mean, originally I did for the Infinite Canvas stuff for comedy writing, just for joke comics, like Homestuck joke comics. But you'll see during this part that actually one strength of, I feel like, the Infinite Canvas is that when you have this open in MS Paint and you're just drawing from a script, it gives you a good opportunity to kind of just draw out your train of thought, right? Because everything's on a big scroll. And I figured out when I used this method of, I guess, storytelling, it got easy, for me at least, to really, portray super specific emotions and super specific gestures. Because actually, I like animation more than comics. I prefer animation, but I don't, have time to animate, or haven't had the time to really sit down and do frame by frame animation. So I almost feel like this is a way to express, my love of animation. These big canvases that just go on and on and on. And right, like with normal comics, you just run out of paper. Like, it would be completely impractical to do this. But just this simple thing here of making the canvas infinitely scrollable started to, I guess, open my mind about what webcomics could do. So before I get any deeper into my fan comics, I want to at least establish for the viewers who aren't aware, what Homestuck looks like, to sort of show you, what is the baseline of what I was inspired by, and kind of the ways that I tried to build off of it or deviate from it specifically. So I'll just show you the most basic panels of Homestuck. Even people who don't know Homestuck probably know this page. This is the first page. So the basic format of Homestuck, you have a panel, which will usually have a little bit of animation, and then it'll have text underneath, and then the next button. They interact through these little boxes, and it's the way they talk is if you were just talking to your friends online. And everybody's color coded. That's another thing. So that's the basic format of Homestuck right there. And of course, in itself, Homestuck does so much with its own format in as it goes along. It's 8,000 pages, so it had a lot of time to experiment with the form and the capabilities of webcomics. It was really the first and one of the only examples of really using storytelling online, using the tools that are specific to the medium. So by this point in the story, the whole format is being flipped on its head, and so it's using now the header that would usually just be the MSPA information. Now we're using that part of the story and show what one character's doing at the same time as another character. You also, Homestuck plays so much with text art. You hover over this, right? You get extra dialogue that's attached to your mouse. This really inspired me, right? So my comic Jade Route is specifically a fan comic that is a continuation of the Homestuck epilogues. And let me pull up what the epilogues look like, because it's a little different. This is the Homestuck epilogues. This is, as the title suggests, is what happens after the story when the characters are all grown up. When this came out, it really like brought back all those inspired feelings I had from the original Homestuck. The epilogues is formatted, and you can actually buy like a physical novel version of it, which is it's a pretty cool book because you can turn it upside down and read it, which I'm not going to explain any further how that works. But yeah, it's there's no images in the epilogues, and it depends a lot on narration. And a big part of the story is the idea of like who's narrating it and what are they thinking while they're telling the stories of these people who they know. Okay, so bringing it back to Jade Route, after Homestuck, after the epilogues, I was inspired to start messing around with text art myself. Because Jade Route takes place after the epilogues, I reintroduced drawings back into the story. But I wanted to keep the narration, and so I just wondered like, would there potentially be a vantage point a character could take to sort of step outside the story and be able to perceive the narration. My way of portraying that is making the narration physically a part of the environment. Skewing it in perspective. And now messing around with different characters, sort of fighting over the narrative. Because that's a recurring theme sort of throughout Homestuck, but especially the epilogue. So I thought, like, how can I use text art to show this? Then messing around with the layering, like suggestive of what, like, metatextual layers of the story are certain concepts appearing on. Like, if you had narration and you have a visual story, I just liked messing around with the idea of, like, how do those things overlap? Yeah, Jade wipes away the text with her hand. She forgets to talk smaller. The premise of this part is that Jade is stuck outside of the story, so you see like she's no clipping through stuff. And that's why she's able to perceive the narration in the first place. But she can't actually, her text is stuck in the background and she phases through stuff, so she's in a place where she can't actually interact with what's in the story. She can interact with the space containing it, though. I think I just sort of iteratively worked off of each idea. First the idea that the panel doesn't have to be a certain size on the browser. Then the idea that you could use text in creative ways to tell a story. And now those concepts are sort of intersecting in this segment where the panel gets shifted out of place. And I just thought Homestuck is, if you're going to do this with anything, Homestuck really is like the perfect story to break, I guess you could say. Because if you read Homestuck, it really is always breaking itself. So it's just a really fun place to experiment with, like, unique storytelling abilities that I felt like were kind of specific to things that I liked. Yeah. And I mean, so much of this, I drew this whole comic in MS Paint. I would do if I had to do something special with layering, I'd use Psy, but I tried as much as I could to just draw it in MS Paint because at the time I was like uploading it in bits on Twitter in a giant thread, which in itself is an extremely crazy thing to do, very strange. There's a sequence where Jade, she's still in the space outside of the story, and she's fighting a specific version of herself. And they're using panels of Homestuck to fight each other. A panel of Homestuck jabs her in the head, and again, like before, I start breaking the space. Like I start breaking the canvas, creating cracks in it, creating rips in it. We see what's on the other side of wherever Jade is, which is where the narrator hangs out. And finally, she breaks through the panel. I think after Jade Route and after especially doing Godhead for a while, my interest sort of pivoted more into using custom like HTML, more so than playing with what's in the image itself. So I can show you some examples of places where custom HTML can be used. Here's my other fan comic, Y12K. This one, rather than having the text embedded in the images like Jade Route, it's more text heavy, and the text itself is HTML. Like you can highlight it, and you see how it really like parallels the format of the epilogue. But I did keep illustrations in it. The part of Y12K where I start messing around with CSS is gets in a few parts, but there's one part in chapter 3 where here the background starts shifting into black as we enter Dirk's mind, and this gradient here, this is done with CSS. You see as it gets darker, blacker, Caliborn, which is the antagonist, his text gets more contrasting. He's getting louder, right? And I pull from that part of or those parts of Homestuck here, where sometimes they do like a recolor of the traditional format of the comic to represent like a specific character's point of view or domain or experience, right? So sort of creating this mind space by shifting the background and shifting the format. This part is a newspaper found on the version of Earth in this comic, and here I just use different fonts and different font options that CSS gives you. So yeah, like the typo underlines under the text and everything, that's all enabled just with HTML and CSS. I really wanted to use everything I had learned after spending so much time on Godhead, particularly with the CSS stuff, right? And then I have this not a GIF, it's also CSS. And I even made some special code to make the text colors oscillate the way I wanted. And here's one part of the comic that's it's animated. It's animated entirely with CSS. So around the same time that I was making Jade Route, I was starting my original comic Godhead. And so while I was doing those initial experiments with Infinite Canvas on Jade Route, I decided this is on the 4th page of Godhead. It's like I want to do an Infinite Canvas on this too. But I want to try to make it a little more complicated by combining horizontal and vertical, like long canvases, as well as adding sound. So when you enable the sound on this page, it reacts to your scroll position. Right, so tracks of the song, they come in and out depending on what panel you scroll to. The song was done by McLean Winston, who built a lot of Godhead from the start. Want to get to that note? Yeah, so literally the technology for this is building off of the thing I showed you before, right? But because we have more images here, we have this woman. I'll hover over this, and then hover over this. We have many different ones. So the main idea for that is that when you're trying to combine a bunch of different images, and you want to be more in control of like how they appear relative to each other, because normally a normal HTML file would probably take all of these and just stack them on top of each other. I mean, it's like what you see on the internet every day. You just see things like either next to each other or stacked on top of each other. So in order to like achieve this, you go into the body element, which represents like the entire page basically. And then you give it a width that is like a combination of the widths of all your images. You're basically just telling the page, like, make yourself big enough for all these images so that they can appear side by side. Um, as for the sound part, okay, that was more complicated, I'll say, but be sure that yes. So what I do here is when you scroll onto each image, here I have the console telling you which image are you looking at, and you might be looking at two at the same time. Now, to do this, you do need JavaScript, which is, like, I'd say it's the next level above HTML and CSS. I'd say is accessible, pretty accessible to anybody who wants to learn it. JavaScript's a little more like, it's straight up coding, programming. So I know not everybody wants to do that, but for the people who are interested, you can take a look. Okay, we're on this page. And by the way, to open up a developer's console on your browser, if you want to look at any page online, you just do this. Right-click on the page, and then inspect. And you'll have access to all this. So, we'll take a quick look at the code. I won't go full on in, but basically we have a sound button, this red button at the top. This is our play sound button, and it toggles. Is the sound playing? Yes or no? True or false? Yeah, now it's playing. Now it's off. So then we also have these sound clips. They represent each layer of the song that fade in and out depending on which image you're looking at. And in order to tell, what image the reader is looking at, we use a function. And the function basically just tells, right? It takes an element, an element is anything on the page. So an element is, let's say, this image, or this image. And it just uses some code stuff that I don't feel like anybody really wants to get that deep into right now. But basically, every time you scroll, this function is run. Yeah, here we have a piece of code that says every time the user scrolls, check if, each and every panel is in the center of the screen. And if the panel is in the center of the screen, change the volume based on that. So it's not complicated logic, and really you saw the code isn't very long either. And like I said, the first time we uploaded this, it took one night. It took only one night to really put this demo together. And over the years, I've gone back and I've edited some things and improved them a bit. But the basic functionality, it was always here. So I'd say, and I'm not the most experienced coder. I do coding almost exclusively through web design, doing stuff like this. Basically, if I'm doing art and I want to make something happen, I'll try my best to learn how to write the code for that thing. So I'm very experience oriented. I don't sit around studying code for fun usually. I just do a lot of trial and error. But if you're interested in things like this, you do want to learn the basics of HTML, CSS, and the very basics of coding. And I think you'll find that doing things that seem really complicated for webcomics as a medium specifically is more possible for you than you think.
There are a lot of different formats that are completely accessible, but they just might have a learning curve that requires a bit of research. I'm Alexis Rippin, and I do a bunch of stuff, a lot of which stemmed from work I've done in fandom or roughing off it. I'm a writer, editor, and comic artist, an art director for indie games, and a web and graphic designer. My personal projects bounce off and grow from each other, so I'll be going through several projects that I consider transformative fan work in comics, starting with one of my earliest, Scrollform. Scrollform can be summed up as explorations of the tension between off and online living. I won a grant for my senior project and did a series of interviews with different people who I only knew, to varying levels, from their online personas. The background research I did for this project, combined with my constant internet use, ended up being the inspiration for the Scrollform 01 zine. Learning to enjoy and dig into research, experimenting with different visual formats and styles, as well as how appropriating existing IP and reference can efficiently add layers to simple ideas. I was heavily inspired, even at this point, by Million Fish's fan works such as Yellow Cake, both in terms of just raw quality and composition, but also how they integrate the original medium of the Metal Gear Solid games into the pages. It allows for an almost visually meditative pace of going through the script of the comic, approaching similar ideas from multiple angles without derailing the conversation happening. Fancomics, similar to fanfic, gives a lot of flexibility for experimenting with abstract presentations because there's already a presumed shared knowledge of the source material. Butchverse started around the time when Marvel Comics seemed to be considering how to distance the character Frank Castle, the Punisher, from the fascist and white supremacist quote-unquote fans who co-opted the Skull iconography. I figured I might as well also get to have fun with it, and started drawing a series of Punisher and Daredevil as Butches. And then I started writing about it, and ended up with a couple essays talking about queering Big Two comics, pronouns, fandom misogyny and transphobia, mask aesthetics and fascism, disability paired with a super ability, and picking out details of each character, arguing the coherency of adding an additional layer of gender to their narratives. I collected everything I'd made about the two characters into a zine that I sold out of in local comic shops and at tabling events. I've sold out of is exciting to say, and also very easy to achieve if you print books yourself, especially since you're doing generally small runs. I've probably printed a bit over 100 copies of the first Butchverse, but had a much higher return on them because the cost of printing was so low, maybe about $1 per book. I had to do all the printing and binding myself, which did take time, but I could crank out at least 50 in a short afternoon. Printing, and thus publishing, and a good chunk of the way towards distributing your own work is so much easier than you think. There are so many different ways to bind your own longer books, from perfect binding, spiral binding, or any other number of DIY and unique options. You can do pretty much whatever level of personalization you want. It'll just end up dependent on how much time and materials you want to spend on it. I tend to format work in half-letter dimensions for easy printing and take into account the necessary printing margin. If I really wanted a full bleed where the ink goes all the way to the edge, I'd either have to print on a bigger sheet of paper or cut it down to a small size. I'm personally lucky because I live near a few print shops. My preference is my local university's print lab that just got a new laser printer that has pretty good rates for black and white. There's plenty of guides out there for pretty much any kind of printing you plan on doing, so I'll spend more time talking about something that was a bigger pain for me to figure out when I started, which is paper types. Deciding what paper to use is one of the most straightforward yet excruciating parts because of how complicated the naming can be, especially if you don't have samples in front of you. There are countless options that are going to suit different kinds of projects, but I'll try to give a general rundown of what most of the options you'll want to look at will be. For the printer type, most paper you buy, especially for your own home printer, will note as either being for inkjet or as laser printers, sometimes both. Most home color printers will be inkjet and use the liquid ink you buy in cartridges. They're best for photos and color-heavy print jobs. Laser printers use toner, a powder that gets heated onto the paper. Most large office printers will be laser because they can print higher volumes faster with sharp letters for cheaper than replacing that amount in liquid ink. For my project, since I didn't use a coated paper and had printing on the spine folds, I used inkjet for my cover alone. Laser printing sits on top of the paper, so when creased, it can crack the ink and show the paper underneath sometimes. Coated versus uncoated will decide the texture of the paper. Uncoated will be more like the paper of a lot of novels, paperbacks, and manga, while coated types will be very smooth like in most color comic books, and will have a more rich color. Coated types will often have a gloss and maybe a satiny option, and will have a lot nicer overall feel. Regarding paper weight, you're going to start with, text versus cover. Basically, the two main categories of paper type. Text will be generally for internal pages and more thinner. Cover for the outside and will be thicker. Paper weights will differ between the two categories, so a 60-pound cover weight can be pretty similar in thickness to a 110-pound text weight, so you need to make sure you're checking which one they're labeled as. Especially if you're making your own books, you can do all kinds of fun customizations that you would struggle to get with a professional shop, or at least it would be a lot more expensive. For my Wizard Battle zine, I used vellum for the centerfold for a cool transparent effect in the comic, and I've also seen a lot of projects use different color paper, textures, and cutouts, some you'll see later in Max's part. You can also get varying weights, textures, and levels of premium from different sources. A lot of paper sellers will offer sample kits, and if there's a local shop, they might have something that you can flip through there. I can go on and on about different paper types, but you won't really be sure what works best for you until you see and feel the papers yourself. Butchverse ended up being pretty simple in terms of construction, but I still wanted to give myself room to adjust. I started out by just selling the PDF on itch.io, wanting to see what the general response was. After it did pretty well, I ran a pre-order for the first print edition on Etsy, and then sold additional copies online, in some local shops, and then in zine fairs and comic conventions. Overall, Butchverse got a decent amount of attention for how niche it was, and combined with an expanding online circle, I ended up getting invited to submit a piece for Yaoi Zine 3, specifically Yuri Zine. The essay I wrote for it ended up being the jumping block for committing to the completing of a second Butchverse zine, this time with an actual 20-page comic in it. Especially knowing that I had a dedicated audience already locked in, it was easier to be self-motivated enough to grind through a lot of the learning hurdles. I used it to test out and find a specific style for comics that I had the stamina to maintain through a longer project than I was used to. When I sold the first Butchverse online, I offered a pack option with a few themed mini prints and stickers, but for the second one, I wanted to kick it up a notch. I was lucky one of my favorite artists and a lead member of my favorite comic collective, Ghost Fruits, had commissions open and was down to draw the design for the themed shirt, thus birthing one of the greatest images ever drawn. We talked a bit about it, and I always think back to the way he described making a part of the project, as being invited to put a verse on something. I really believe collaboration is one of the most powerful tools we have as artists, being able to connect to each other with different skills and create really exciting stuff. The network and visibility I gained from fan work had also made opportunities for original work easier to access. I've been given permission to announce that I'll have a short comic included as part of the upcomic Glimmer magazine, Volume 2, which is coming out later this year. I also got tagged in to do art and design work on more than one indie game and webcomic project that came from the work I did with friends I made in previous fandoms. The upcoming anthology I'm editing, American Fujo, in part was able to have as successful as a Kickstarter as it did because of the reputations of my co-editor, T-Shirt, and I had built engaging in fandom throughout our smaller scale projects, not to mention the connections that made it easy to find writers and artists for it. It feels shady to call fandom a form of networking, but I want to emphasize that building friendships with other artists that boost each other up and push you to make more interesting things and think harder, work harder, is never a waste of time, even if it's fandom. Practicing being an active fan and experimenting with transforming existing narratives was how I refined my approach to critical writing and research. I've always been interested in research, and I consider writing argumentative and opinion essays a kind of nonfiction fanfiction. One thing that can make the transition from fan to original work daunting is the fear of not seeming original enough. While there's plenty of amazing work where the inspiration is obvious, sometimes you really just want to break out of orbit, especially if you're like me and have ever found yourself multiple AUs deep. What worked for me was examining what themes and topics I was most interested in from the fan work I was making, reading other stories and nonfiction related to those themes, and then figuring out a story I wanted to tell from that. I switched personalities around and had plots that could only happen with the new characters I was creating, and not the ones I'd been making fan art of. The story I wanted to tell was the most important, and I wanted the characters to serve it instead of the other way around. It's why kin onions for OCs are so popular. You can pick from existing characters and narratives and worlds, and make sure you're mixing them enough to actually be something new. They're like little mood boards. I've also seen people suggest that making collections of posts, memes, or other kinds of ephemera help a lot. They can also help with making tough choices if you're still figuring out the new character. For creating the character Lauren Kennedy, I started this with The Onion, but ended up using it differently than I think I've seen a lot of other people use it. I sorted the characters into quadrants based on what part of their character I wanted to reference the most. Over time, as I wrote out the complete story, this isn't as accurate as to how they turned out, but it was really helpful for getting started, especially because I intentionally didn't add Daredevil to it, forcing myself to approach my OC from a different perspective and context, and commit to them being a totally different character. I've seen people ask about worrying that they're copying too much from a story they like, and are worried about reading more stories and unintentionally copying from those as well. But the truth is that reading more and watching more is the way out. because we always take inspiration from what we know, whether consciously or not. A lot of the time it's from research or people we know, but always from stories. Taking in more different experiences, real or fictional, gives you more to draw from. It lets you see what is really special to that one character versus what might be a trope with a genre. It's similar to learning how to draw something from memory. If you do one study of a shrimp, then you'll know how to draw a shrimp from that angle, in that lighting. The more different shrimp you draw in different poses, from different angles, in different light, you start to understand all the ways a shrimp can look, how the shrimp works. You can start combining poses and angles to draw a shrimp that you've never seen before, all from your visual library in your head. Soon you're making your own original shrimp content. Writing a narrative is presenting an argument, even if it's as simple as, wouldn't it be crazy if such and such happened? Or perhaps wouldn't it be really hot? Details are added in like supporting evidence to make the story, the characters, and the world convincing, compelling, and coherent. Maintaining a curiosity about the world, how things work, how people exist is a huge benefit, and there are a few strategies I like in building and maintaining the information that can accumulate from it. It goes without saying that I'm hopelessly dependent on Notion. The recent AI tools they added are opt-in, so I can ignore them, and the plan I get is the plus one for free with my university alumni email that totally makes it worth it. But it's just an easy place where I can have both organized and chaotic note-keeping in a layout where I can actually use them later. My method has two main branches. I have different pages for loose notes and ideas that I can just jot down quickly, and then dedicated pages for building out specific concepts. The first bridge first was a page where I added every idea I had related to Daredevil and the Punisher, and then I organized the major ones into themes. Then I started writing. I let myself at least get down any tangent I came up with, and then either move them to a discard pile, or if long enough, separate it out to build into its own essay. Some of the discards from the first zine ended up being used in the second, so it's always nice to keep a record of your thought process. While I mainly use Notion for active writing and organization, I've started to build out a longer-term conceptual system with Obsidian, as it's one of the better recommended programs for creating a sort of digital Zettelkasten. Zettelkasten is a popular personal knowledge management system that focuses on building the connections between ideas. It's traditionally based in a flexible filing system, ordering cards based on concept and facilitating shorter, looser ideas to build on top of each other. Obsidian's idea web view especially allows for interesting connections and trends to be rediscovered long after the notes have been taken. The focus is less on chronologically sorting information and more on allowing ideas to mature over time through growing the web of interconnected notes. It's similar to the ethos of digital gardening, though perhaps less public. They both prioritize taking ownership over what you're learning and allowing the process to take as long as it needs to. It's about taking yourself out of the constant flow of data and slop with malevolent owners that want you to be miserable and misinformed. You can control your own garden and not have to fear your space being taken down suddenly. And unlike the usual personal blog, they're not based on the prioritization of most recent completed work. Maggie Appleton describes them more as free-form work-in-progress wikis. While I like to think that at least some of the essays in my zines were at least a little polished, working in a visual-focused format allowed me to take smaller, looser ideas and present them as visual spreads that still held their own next to writing. I use zines to reach milestones of being ready to share collections of thought and art with other people, and hear feedback from people I know actually want to engage with the totality of it, as opposed to the hells of posting hot takes ad nauseum. It also helps to keep motivation through research stages when you see a potential finish line where you can make a cool little project that you can even sell. Having goals while studying is important for keeping it up, and small, even personal essays can do a lot. The best way to learn and actually retain information is to be applying it while you learn, relating it to the world, thinking about how you can use it. How does this affect my life, my practice, or expand my understanding of the world to better put things into the world, to portray ideas bigger than myself? I personally can't stand most YouTube essayists or summarists, and recommend following researchers directly or finding essays and books on topics you find interesting. I'm a sucker for eFlex's technology and art articles, Verso Books catalog, different university presses, or just browsing through secondhand bookstores. There's so much inspiration and knowledge to be gained from small press, micropress, and other self-publishers, creators of comics but also zines and written work. So many groups that print and distribute their own work also make guides and booklets about their production methods. I really like Genderfail, Bay Oakley's publishing, programming, and archiving platform. Publishing Now, Genderphil's working class guide to making a living off self-publishing, is a fantastic resource from them, even if more in the book arts and writing than in comics specifically. But also, be inspired by your friends. Reach out to people in your sphere, see if they're interested in projects. Sometimes they'll say no, but sometimes they'll say yes. Be a good collaborator and willing to put in a bulk of the work, and understand that occasionally things don't work out, especially if it's just for fun. And by being flexible and opening yourself up to new things, you can explore new formats and methods. Speaking of which, here's Max.
Hello, I'm Max Banshees, and in this presentation I'll be covering how fan work has been a way for me to experiment and grow as an artist. Specifically, I'll be focusing on zines and cyanotypes, and how my interest in these two mediums came about from collaborating with other fan artists from around the world. I'll also talk about how working within constraints has had a particular influence on my work, especially when it comes to printing things at home and shipping them internationally. To give you a little bit of background on myself, I'm mainly an illustrator. I run a shop where I sell prints of my drawings, but I also do freelance work for anthologies and magazines. My work has appeared in publications dedicated to horror, science fiction, and erotic art such as Death in the Mouth, Strange Horizons, and Slick House. I also make comics and art books. I like to print them out in small formats like zines or accordion books, but I also like making larger stuff that goes in booklets. Occasionally, I make cyanotypes. This is the same process that was used to make blueprints in architecture, but in my case, I use it for drawings and paintings. Across the fandoms that I've been in, there have been three main factors that have influenced my work. The first of these is collaboration. For example, I've worked with writers to make fancomics, and I've worked with other artists to make art books. Being able to rely on other people's skills to make up for what you lack, as well as being inspired by them, even when you're not working with them directly, has helped me to grow immensely as an artist. Another factor is how the fandoms that I've been in have been very international in nature. When I started mailing comics and prints, I realized that being able to send stuff in an envelope with 1 or 2 stamps was the most easy and affordable way I could do it. So I began to really work within the limitations of sending stuff with stamps. That experience got me thinking more broadly about working within constraints, both in the narrative side of my work, as well as in the printmaking techniques I've used. I'll circle back to the art book you see here at the end of the presentation, so just put a pin in it for now. Before I go ahead and show more of my work, there are 2 artists that I wanted to talk about who aren't a part of the fandoms that I've been in, but they've inspired me a lot. Even before I had the skills or supplies to do what I do now, I really admired Joe and Anka's work on their comics and websites, especially on their ongoing comic Superpose. I've also really loved the prints and zines that they send out in the mail through their Patreon. I first became familiar with their work in 2018, and seeing them have a continued practice of making digital and physical art was what inspired me to do the same. If it weren't for them, this presentation wouldn't exist, so I wanted to give them the first of several shoutouts today. To start off, I'll go over a fan comic that I made in 2022 called Hamato Poetry. Originally, it was a story that a fellow fan of the video game Pathologic had posted online the year before. His name is Judas Salieri, and he's an illustrator, writer, and comic artist from Spain. I jumped on the opportunity to adapt Hamato Poetry into a comic for 2 reasons. One is that it's a fairly short story, at under 2,000 words in length. The other reason is that the fanfiction is in script format because Pathologic, and a few other works that influenced Hamato Poetry, are tied to theater. If it were written like a novel, I would have had to go through the effort of turning it into a script and potentially losing what made the work really strong in its original format. Hamato Poetry is a reverse murder mystery, where you know who the killers and the victims are from the start, but you're more interested in seeing what happens if the killers get caught. This comic focuses on a trio from Pathologic called Threefold Bullet. The fan art you'll see in this presentation is generally about these characters, along with a 4th one who is the victim from this comic. Hamato Poetry was the first serious comic I had ever made. It was over 33 pages long and in full color, so it was a bit of a trial by fire for me. But I'm grateful for the experience that it gave me in this medium. The comic led to a great creative partnership between him and I. Most recently, we paired up to work on an entry for Slick House, which was an erotic horror anthology published in 2025. It was crowdfunded and distributed entirely online, which I think is a great way to get these books in people's hands. It cuts down on the production and shipping costs, which, as I've learned over the years from distributing my own books, really eats up a lot of the budget on projects. Aside from being great to work with, Judas's comics were a large reason why I started making them myself back in 2021. His pathologic fan comic, Sui Generis, made a particular impact on me. There are two parts from it that I wanted to bring up for this presentation because of how they changed the direction of my art. The first one happens a few pages into the comic. It's a scene where one character tells his friend that he's been expelled from college and he's going across the continent with his brother to look for work. That scene cuts to another one where you see that friend at his desk, looking very frustrated and abandoned while holding a dead bird. That sense of abandonment is really amplified by how his desk is in a white void and there's no dialogue in it at all. It's just him and his loneliness on that page. I really like these two pages as a reader, but I also know that if it were up to me to script and draw all of this, I probably wouldn't be able to do it. I'm not as good or as interested at writing dialogue as him, but this isn't entirely a bad thing. It just means that my priorities are elsewhere. This part, on the other hand, was one that I really liked as a reader, and I also felt that I could take something from it for my own work. It happens right at the end of the comic, and the impact of it might be a little lost if you haven't seen how the different symbols in it are built up and gain meaning over time. But even without that knowledge, I think the focus on motion in it is really wonderful. I like the birds flying across the panels on the first page and the masked figures clapping in the second one. I also like that bit of magic at the end where one bird turns into three after it lands on the dead man's hand. I almost felt like I was looking at a motion study from Edward Muybridge in the form of a comic. At the time, I knew I wouldn't necessarily be able to make dramatic and compelling stories with just this visual device, but I still felt a pull towards it. I also discovered Julia Graffair's work around the same time. She makes comics and zines that are usually in the horror genre. Publishers like Fantagraphics have distributed her longer work, but her own imprint, Thuban Press, focuses on mini-comics and analog self-publishing. A lot of her work is done on these rigid grids, and across a row, you usually see a bit of motion across each panel, as well as snippets of dialogue. It helps to make her characters feel vulnerable and human in a dangerous world, or at least a world full of unknowns. Here you can see a scene from her comic Dark Age, where the two main characters are exploring a cave, and they stumble upon a part of it full of crystals or sharp rocks. After I finished Hematopoetry, I didn't have the time and energy to make a comic that large again, but I still wanted to make things. So I focused on zines and small booklets. They were easier to draw and print, and I could mail them to people around the world with a single stamp. Despite the fact that this would mean I'd be making very small books, I still wanted them to be interesting as physical objects. So, over time, I've played around with different ways to achieve that. A simple way is to include a poster or a larger comic on the inside of a zine. It's not something that I invented, but it is something I love to use. Here's an example of that in a zine from 2022 called Seashell. It's also an example of one of the first comics I've made that didn't have any words in it. Here's the digital file for the Seashell comic. As you can see, there's still technically some communication or plot going on, since the comic is about a person accepting a similar gift in two different situations. But all of this isn't communicated with dialogue. Instead, the emphasis is more on how those seashells are handled in the person's hands, and how the people's facial expressions hint at their moods. Seashells, and a few other things, are going to be recurring motifs in this presentation because they're a way to represent very specific elements from Pathologic in a more personalized or open-ended way. On the left, you can see a building from the game that is associated with Threefold Bullet, and on the right is a seashell that resembles how it looks. This is where the transformative aspect of this fan work comes from. I like to find things that capture a feeling or interest I have towards Pathologic, and then I iterate on that thing and push it to its limits until it becomes something that fascinates me in general, as opposed to it being tied to the fandom it's for. There are still going to be things in these comics that fans will catch on to more easily than other people, but my hope is that through the visual experimentation I do, these elements become more broadly interesting. Here's a more recent zine. This one's from 2024, and it's called Black Bar Paintings. The fold-out poster is on the outside instead of the inside, so the pages of the zine are made out of little parts of a larger illustration. Here are some pictures of the fold-out poster that one of my friends in South Korea sent me. The larger illustration is of 3 figures at a bar, but the pages alternate between showing the original bar scene, an X-ray view of it, and a separate illustration entirely. Here's something a little different. It's a black and white booklet from 2022 called Incomplete Image. This is the back and the front cover. The title is written out with a letter substitution cipher, so each letter needs to be shifted 17 places forward in the alphabet in order to read the text. When you open the booklet, the first spread you see has this garbled text made out of the title, and then a person's face in a frame. But the trick with this booklet is that he actually isn't printed on the page. Instead, he's a part of the next spread, and you only see him because there's a hole cut in one of the pages. The zine doesn't exactly have a plot. Instead, it was a way for me to explore things like encoded messages and events that are missing information, which are elements associated with these characters. Incomplete Image was also strongly influenced by an artist I had found at the time called Tauba Auerbach. Like Julia Graffair, they have a publishing practice that involves doing everything as in-house as possible, with supplies and tools that most people have access to, but the subject matter and appearance of their work is different. Their publishing practice is called Diagonal Press, and here you can see a book called A Partial Taxonomy of Periodic Linear Ornament, along with its Bristol board cover. The book covers a particular group of shapes and some questions and related topics that came out of studying them. I was really drawn to the visual rhythms in this book, as well as how stark and bold it looked, so I wanted to try my hand at using text for a similar effect. Here's another booklet of mine from 2022. It's called Utopian Scrapbook 2. Like Incomplete Image, the title is written out with a letter substitution cipher, but this time you have to shift the letters 22 places forward in the alphabet in order to read the text. The booklet was drawn traditionally, and in the process of scanning and printing it, I've cut the messy reverse side of pages where the markers I used bled through. It's a little long, so I won't show much of it, but here's the other side of the hand drawing, along with some incomplete portraits. And at the end of the booklet, you get to see the parts that were missing in those portraits. While not being comics in the traditional sense, these last 2 booklets were a way for me to start becoming more conscious about making work intended for print. By that, I don't only mean that they were formatted correctly to be printed, I also mean that from the start, this work was intended to be printed, and its best experience as a physical object. At the time that I was making these first scenes, I mainly had access to color printing at school. At home, I had a little black and white laser printer that was given to me by a friend of the family. I wanted to increase the number of colors I could get out of the printer, so I got into making cyanotypes of my drawings and paintings, since all you need is a black and white negative, some UV light, and optional stuff to change the color of your prints, which initially come out blue. This cyanotype is from a little later, but it shows how you can tone and bleach your prints into a different color. You use things like coffee, black tea, and baking soda for this. These 2 are a little more complex. They're done in 2 passes, with the first layer being toned with coffee, tea, and baking soda, and the second layer is left as blue, though it's also toned with coffee a bit. After that, I would add some details in with white charcoal, so I'd essentially have 5 colors to play with. The first is the beige of the paper. The second is the white details that I draw in. The third and fourth are the blue and brown parts on their own, and the fifth is a nearly black color that you get when the blue and the brown overlap. I don't always have time to print cyanotypes, since it's a very hands-on process, but I love it for that reason too. When I graduated from college in 2023, I got my own color laser printer and started working on books with new formats. This is an accordion book called Legible Only as a Simile. It's about 3 characters dancing with each other, but you only see 2 of them at the same time in each panel. The right side of this accordion book has also been singed with a lighter. Here's an accordion book from 2024 called Vessel. This one was printed on black cardstock with a special white toner, along with regular toner. On the left, you can see the cover of the accordion book, which is a wine glass with cracks inside and outside of it. On the right, you can see the 4 panels of the comic. It shows someone brushing their ear against their shoulder, a close-up of their ear bleeding, an eye looking at the viewer in shock, and a seashell with fractured glass inside of it. A zine that touches on the same subject matter, but with different iconography, is this one called Sour from 2023. It compares romance and violence to winemaking. Zines and accordion books have different advantages and disadvantages. For instance, you can technically display more at once in an accordion book, but with a zine, you're able to hide surprises for the reader to find when they turn the page. This zine uses that to transition between the more friendly dance scenes from the first spread to the violence and the crushed grapes on the last one. It took me a while to get back to making things that were comparable to Hamato poetry and how complex they were, but in 2023, I finally got around to making one. This comic is called The Experience of Human or Divine Love Seems Inevitably Grounded in Pain. The title is from the book The Lady as Saint by Brigitte Cazelle, and the section that it's from talks about how the suffering of female saints and heroines is depicted differently from the suffering of male figures. Specifically, heroines tend to suffer in silence for their own salvation and for the salvation of male heroes. Their suffering also tends to take on a physical and erotic role. My comic wasn't a one-to-one adaptation of the ideas in The Lady as Saint, but it was a way for me to think loosely and simultaneously about the themes in that book, along with the themes associated with these characters inside of the game and outside of it in the fandom. Specifically, I was interested in comparing and contrasting love between humans and love between a human and something more abstract, like science or architecture or vices. With my comic, I wanted to create a sort of space where all of these symbols interacted and merged with each other in order to be read in different ways. To do that, I kept all of the panels in the comic on the same 3x3 layout, which allows each panel to have more or less the same visual weight. It also lets you look at a panel or row or column on one page, and then find the corresponding panels on another page in order to start building associations with what's in them. The previous slide had 2 pages that were made entirely out of images, so I could show you some of the stuff that I did with that tool alone. But the comic was actually set up in a way where, on the left, it would have panels with quotes from the game, and on the right, there would be panels with images. Even though the text was from specific characters and specific moments, I decontextualized them so they could be read as openly as the images. In another comic that was done in this style, the focus might be a little more on motion. This is Against Consumption, which is an original work that I finished up at the start of 2025. One example of motion being the focus in this comic is in the first spread you see. It's dedicated entirely to the process of shucking oysters. Things get a little more varied as the comic goes on. For instance, in the centerfold, you can see an anatomical figure dancing with its own skin, or a hand making gestures, or the anatomical figure staring at you and letting out a scream. Like the previous comic, this one uses sudden jumps between panels and pages to make you form associations between unrelated and unexpected imagery. But you also get to appreciate things being frozen in time within each panel. I wanted to wrap up this presentation with an art book that some people in the Threefold Bullet fandom and I just finished making. A lot of us are moving away from this fandom, and fandoms in general, so I see the book as a bit of a bittersweet retrospective. The art in the book is from a broken telephone game that one of my friends in Brazil set up. In the game, you draw something, blur it, turn it into grayscale, and then pass it on to the next person so they can draw on top of it. Here, you can see my entry on the left, titled Sleepwalkers. In total, there were 10 people playing this game, and we came from all sorts of places around the world, like Canada, Chile, Brazil, France, South Korea, Spain, and the United States. Like the rest of the work in this presentation, it wasn't a big project meant to earn everyone a lot of money or recognition. Instead, it was more of a chance to look back at the imagery and symbolism that we had developed for these characters over the course of several years. Ultimately, this is what's special to me about fanworks and zines and alternative printing processes. You can work with limited resources and a small audience to make something special for each other, and you develop a lot of perseverance and flexibility along the way because of it. I'll always keep that in mind, even as I move forward and start working on bigger projects and original art. Thank you very much for your time. I'd like to give a huge shout out to Alexis for getting this panel together, and to Spicy Yeti and Alexis for participating alongside me on the panel. I'd also like to thank the Cartoonist Cooperative for organizing the Nib and Ink Fest. You can see Alexis's portfolio at wizardkicks.com, Spicy Yeti's portfolio at spicyyeti.com, and the Cartoonist Cooperative's homepage at cartoonist.coop. If you'd like to keep up with my work, you can visit my portfolio at maxbanshees.com. I hope you all enjoy this panel, and that you continue to enjoy the Nib and Ink Fest.
All right. Thank you so much to everyone also for staying. And if there are any final questions that people wanted to ask before we wrap up, now is the time to do so. All right, I'll be sharing the Cartoonist Cooperative donation link in the chat real quick. And I'm glad everyone enjoyed it. Everyone make sure to have a good rest of your day and also check out the other panels that are happening for the rest of the month.